the crowding out effect. Before we get into the actual effect, we have to do a review of the loanable funds market. The loanable funds market shows effects on interest rates of changes in saving and borrowing. So the savers add or subtract the supply of loanable funds, because the more money you put in the bank, the more money becomes available for banks to loan out. So if you put more money into the bank, or you save more, or MPS, for example, goes up because that's the amount that's saved, then banks can loan out more money, so there's more supply available of loanable funds, and so supply would increase. When you, or government, borrows more or less money, demand for loanable funds can shift. So if more people are looking to take out loans, so more people are going to college, more people buying cars, more people buying houses, they demand more loanable funds, and that shifts the demand curve for loanable funds. So here's a graph of the loanable funds market. We have the real interest rate. Okay, so when we account for inflation, that's the interest rate. And the quantity of loanable funds on the x-axis, so that's usually just labeled as QLF. And then we have the demand, which is downward sloping like we're used to, and supply that's upward sloping. And the equilibrium point shows what the current interest rate is at, as well as the quantity of loanable funds that are available. So once again, supply deals with the amount of money that's saved, the amount of money that's available to be loaned out. So the more people, or the more money that people put in banks, the more that's available for loanable funds, so the supply would increase. And when the supply increases, interest rate is going to fall, which means that more people, quantity demanded for loanable funds is higher because of the lower interest rate. Or let's say the government is going to deficit spend during the recession of 2008-2009. Then the government is demanding more loanable funds, which is going to cause that interest rate to rise. And it's the impact of the rise of the real interest rate that is going to affect aggregate demand through what we call the crowding out effect. So the crowding out effect itself is sometimes during expansionary policy, the government decides to cut taxes and increase spending. This often leads to a deficit, which increases the debt. But the government needs to borrow the money. It's not just magic that, okay, we're going to spend $3 trillion this year and we only brought in $2 trillion, so magically the $1 trillion will appear because we're the government and we say so. The government needs to borrow money whenever they deficit spend, just like anybody else. You want to buy a house, you don't have the money, you have to deficit spend and take out a loan. Same thing with the government. So when the government borrows the money, it competes with the private sector in the loanable funds market, because there are a lot of people demanding, and the government demanding loanable funds, but when one of those groups, either private sector, such as regular people, or the government want to borrow money, that increases the demand for loanable funds. So when this happens, this raises the interest rates, which we're going to show graphically here in a minute, and reduces private investment, which means that there's less loanable funds left over, or at least at a higher interest rate, for other individuals who might want to try starting a business or owning their first home or buying a car or going to college. So all of that gets negatively affected, and so aggregate demand, the effect is going to be that it's going to shift to the left, and we're going to get there. So this is the first effect of what's going to happen. We're eventually going to get to aggregate demand, but the loanable funds market does not have a direct impact on aggregate demand. So when the government needs to deficit spend, it's going to change the demand for loanable funds. So demand is going to increase because now the government needs to borrow more money, so the demand increases, causing a new equilibrium. So interest rate 2, so the interest rate has gone up, and the quantity of loanable funds has also increased. But what we're really worried about here is the interest rate going up. So the real interest rate increases. And that's what's going to have a negative impact on aggregate demand. Because as the real interest rate rises, like I said, imagine this was a 5% interest rate and then a 10%. Some students might not be able to afford to go to college. Some people might not be able to afford a house and have to keep renting until they can save up more money, because at a higher interest rate, it becomes more expensive to borrow. And so for the government too, this will later add to their deficit in the debt as they pay off a higher rate of interest on their loan payment. So the government then in the long run is going to have to spend more money paying off this debt that they've borrowed because they're demanding more loanable funds. Now here we get from the loanable funds market to the decrease in aggregate demand. So we just talked about demand for loanable funds increases, so that increases the interest rate. Now at an increase in the interest rate, we start here at interest rate 1, and so this causes quantity of investment demand. If you need a review, you can go back on the HF Econ website and go back to view investment demand, but it really kind of shows you how much money is being spent. If more money is being, more investment demand means more aggregate demand, less quantity investment demanded leads to less AD. So when the interest rate rises, it becomes more expensive to borrow money, and so investment spending ends up decreasing. The quantity that's investment demanded decreases, and it's that decrease of investment demand that directly then leads to a decrease in aggregate demand. So now we get to the effect on the ASAD model. So I just run the short run and the aggregate demand curve. We're not worried about long run. We're just going to show the effects here. So when government decides they need to borrow money, they're going to deficit spend, and they're going to increase spending by $500 billion. That directly impacts aggregate demand and increases it to the right. Increased spending increases demand. Then the multiplier effect takes hold as consumers then use that money and businesses use the money, and it increases aggregate demand further to the right. And then the crowding out effect, because now private investors, opening your own business, owning a house, now you can't afford it. There's less aggregate demand because your spending has decreased. So it kind of shifts back aggregate demand a little bit. And we don't have numbers, so we can't quantify. Well, just how far does AD4 shift to the left? We don't know. We don't have enough information, especially right now for this video. We don't have information, so we're just saying that aggregate demand increases because of spending, increases because of the multiplier effect, but as people get crowded out, they spend less money, so aggregate demand kind of has to shift back to the left a little bit. So here's the idea of Keynesian fiscal policy kind of from start to finish. The government increases spending. Sometimes they have to borrow the money, and when they do, crowding out takes effect. The multiplier effects takes hold and further boosts aggregate demand, so we have 2 increases in AD. As the government borrows money to pay for the deficit, private investment lowers. So again, groups outside of the government are private, and so they can't afford to take out loans or can't take out as large a loans as before. So aggregate demand shifts left. So at some level, fiscal policy increases, then decreases aggregate demand. Now, what also you might be asking is, well, Mr. Nello, if the government does need to borrow money, and is there an opposite effect? Like, is there a crowding in effect, an opposite of crowding out? And the answer is yes, there is. The opposite is true then. When the government doesn't need to borrow money and they decide, well, we're going to save it instead, that increases the supply of loanable funds, which lowers the interest rate and causes more people to kind of invest. And so there's this idea of crowding in, but we really put much more of a focus on crowding out.